welcome everyone. We're really happy to have you all here with us tonight to hear David Stovall in our third week of Epidemics of Injustice. We're really excited and proud about this class. This is really a student-developed and facilitated class. And we welcome all of our guests with us today. We'll have David for about an hour, and then he's agreed to stay and facilitate questions, so we hope you ask really good questions. We're going to start out with a couple of announcements from Radical Public Health, and then Io's going to introduce our guest speaker.
Hi everybody, my name is Anna Yankelev. I'm a facilitator with Radical Public Health. Radical Public Health is an organization, student organization here comprised of students, alumni, faculty, staff, and community members that are dedicated to helping to push the public health field to consider and to implement more radical solutions that get to the root, to these underlying root causes of health inequities. So one of our biggest projects was putting together the Epidemics of Injustice course, which is now in its second year of running, and we're thrilled that you are all here to join us. And I wanted to take this opportunity to invite all of you to join Radical Public Health. If you are interested in the kind of content that we're bringing to the school and would like to help develop it and help decide what kinds of approaches we look at, what kinds of root causes we assess here in the School of Public Health, please come join Radical Public Health. We have two upcoming events in addition to all of the Epidemics of Injustice sessions. One is next Tuesday, February 26th at 12 p.m. We're having a general info session about what Radical Public Health is. And we're also going to have Dr. Dick David come and speak about the connection between racism and infant mortality. And on March 5th, if you're interested in becoming a facilitator with Radical Public Health, one of the people that helps to coordinate these events, you can join our facilitator training. So this is open to anybody that wants to get more involved in what we're doing. It's going to be March 5th at 5 p.m. in room 114. If you have any questions, I'll be around after the lecture. You can come talk to me about it then. Thanks so much.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another session. So I have the pleasure of reading our speaker's bio, and he's a very renowned person. So David Stovall is a professor of educational policy studies and African American studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Stovall studies the influence of race in urban education, community development, and housing. His work investigates the significance of race in the quality of schools located in communities that are changing both racially and economically. From a practical and theoretical perspective, his research draws from critical race theory, educational policy analysis, sociology, urban planning, political science, community organizing, and youth culture. Join me this evening as we welcome Professor Stovall.
Well, peace and greetings, everybody. Now, if this mic kicks in a strange way, it might kick in kind of later on, but can folks in the back hear me all right? That is the most important. Now, please excuse me for being a little low-tech, right? I bring this board here because this is actually the way that I think. So I've been working on this project for the last 10 years, but I have now started to think about it more succinctly. So what I've been actually doing is writing it out and then photographing it so I can actually return it to my notes in terms of how it is that I'm addressing the issue. First, let me thank the folks at Radical Public Health because that is a revolutionary formation. And I think it's important to state it as such because when we are talking about something being radical, and I always appreciate it because folks in public health and medicine really understand this, you're really talking about something that's coming from the root, right, in opposed to the political formations that people may associate with radical imaginaries and radical interrogations. So thank you all for being who you are in terms of creating the speaker series and actually engaging in that way. Now, when we talk about epidemics of injustice, epidemiologists often look at the markers of the particular space where disease or particular conditions may occur. And coming from the sociology of education and somebody who looks specifically at race and the connection between race, place, and school, I'm actually starting this work and I'm framing this work as a Chicagoan, right? And when I frame this work as a Chicagoan, there's a number of things that come out, right? Because we often talk about particular relationships and ways they play themselves out, but very rarely do we start to insert how we know the work interpersonally. So how I actually frame this is looking at the work of Frantz Fanon, who in Black Skin, White Mask talks about two types of violence. And I think this is when we start to engage these types of this understanding, it pushes us up in a different way. So this thing around a horizontal and a vertical violence. Now, when we talk about horizontal violence, we're talking about violence between folks in the same grouping. That could be socioeconomic, that could be socio-political, that could be peer grouping, that could be in a schoolhouse, as examples. But when we talk about a vertical violence, we're talking about violence from power that is enacted on the powerless, right? Or those who have been deemed to not have power. And both of these horizontal and vertical violences are now part of a structural violence, or I think more succinctly to understand it as a structured violence. So the question that I'm asking is, when we think about things like gun violence, and we start to peel back the layers and actually start to ask questions about what actually gets a shooter to actually engage in the actual act of violence, do we now have to ask a question of a structural violence? And how do we now start to think about that violence structurally? So what are the things that impact a structural violence? And remember, we're not talking about an interpersonal violence, violence between folks, but violence from a system. So now when we talk about violence from a system, where are the spaces that we locate violence from a system? And there are three. School closings, the destruction of public housing, and then the one that we think to be most common is law enforcement. If we think about these three particular life-sustaining entities or life-limiting entities, they all come by way or participate in some form of structural violence. Now, people probably look at this and say, how is school part of a structural violence? The question becomes, what happens in that school, and what are the conditions that impact what happens in those schools? So in Chicago, there are 120 schools that do not have libraries. I consider that a form of structural violence, because the affect is to harm a particular group. There is no purpose of not having a library in the school. If you have denied young folks access to particular life-sustaining entities, the ability to engage something like reading and literacy, you have actually engaged in a process that has the greatest potential to limit their life choices. So if we think about schools, now we have to think about disinvestment. So oftentimes we think about the investing in schools, but we very rarely begin to discuss what has been taken out of schools and what has been taken and removed from schools historically. So when we look at the south and west sides of the city, and in terms of epidemiology, there are these markers that we very rarely see. Now, again, I'm no tech. I was supposed to have a picture of these two things. Didn't happen, all my fault, right? Now, the two pictures are of a red X, and the other one is of a payphone. Now, with my younger students, I show a picture of a payphone, and the first thing I ask them is, do you know what this is? Right? And it's interesting because younger folks are kind of like, some are looking like, what is that? Right? So I have to figure out that that's a whole different set of relationships, right? So when you show this payphone, and when you show this red X, these are two particular markers here in Chicago that have significant meaning. Are folks familiar with seeing the red X? Have people seen this red X before? Right? It's usually a red X that's on a residential building. Sometimes it's on a commercial building. What that red X is doing, it is marking a space for demolition. Right? So the red X means that it has been identified by the county assessor's office and the city of Chicago as a site to be demolished. So now when we see these particular places, and we see the preponderance of red X's, the other question that I'm asking is, what if we look at those red X's and also looked at homicides, school closings, and where public housing has been destroyed? And when we start to map them, why are they all in the same place? So now we begin to ask this larger question. These things come up, and now what is the motive of this disinvestment? Because now, also, one of the results of structural violence is depopulation. The city of Chicago has almost lost 300,000 residents since 2000. Almost 200,000 are black. Of those 178,000 that have been recorded, they all live on the south or west sides of the city. Since 2004, there have been 150 plus schools that have been closed. In 2013, 50 were closed in one summer. So now when we think about that, and those schools are in the same spaces that has actually experienced this massive disinvestment and depopulation. So when we look at public housing, we have to think about things like the Chicago Housing Authority's Plan for Transformation. The Plan for Transformation actually displaced hundreds of thousands of people since 1999. Remember, the Robert Taylor homes on the State Street corridor was the largest public housing unit in the world. And when they started to demolish the buildings beginning in 1999, they also started to close schools on the State Street corridor. So Chicago, in its depopulation, actually has a contradiction there. And one of the contradictions is this idea of concentrated wealth. So the city of Chicago is a city where the rich have gotten richer and poverty has deepened. So now you have wealth disparity in Chicago. And some of you all may have heard the BZ report a couple of days ago that middle income families only account for about 17% of Chicago's population. So now when we start to look at this in a particular way, these things now start to come out. And in terms of wealth disparity, right, and I'm not as worried, even though this is being taped, I'm not as worried because one of the spaces that we have to look at is right here at UIC. Right? So now when we talk about it, it's interesting how they change the names of neighborhoods. We often see this name Tri-Taylor. Right? It's Tri-Taylor / Little Italy, however they want to frame it. And I would encourage folks to check out a neighborhood newspaper called the Gazette. And the Gazette gives you all of the building specs and what's been approved for development here in the Tri-Taylor Little Italy area. And what we see is happening is as folks want proximity to 290, there are new sets of homes being built just west of Weston, right? And just between Ashland and Damon. You know, so there's a hotel coming, there's another good set of buildings that are coming. And the question always for me is, who used to live here and what were the schools like? So now, if we think about this particular practice, I bring in law enforcement because this becomes critical in understanding vertical violence. And I always couch it in a story that I got from a police officer. So I played high school basketball with a guy who used to work on a gang tactical unit. And he's now getting his PhD in sociology. And we were talking about some stuff that I was thinking about in relationship to this. He said, man, I want you to talk to my old commanding officer. And my first response was, oh shit, right? But, because all I think about was, here's another list and I'm gonna get on, right? So we ended up talking, and he said, Stovall, I've heard about your work, and I think you're absolutely right. He said, but I want to tell you something. He said, I want to tell you how to make a killer. What? Right? He said, no, I said, hear me. He said, you do not have a place for them to live. You do not have a viable place for them to go to school. You do not have a viable place for them to work. Substandard health care, and then you hire me to contain them. He said, we know as a police department, there is no black or brown child in the city of Chicago that is born with an inherent propensity to violence. Violence is not pathological, despite what they're trying to study in places like UIC or wherever. Violence is not genetic. So because we know this, we have to ask deeper questions around the violence that's rationalized, in this case, on largely black bodies. So as this violence is rationalized on black bodies, and we put this in the context of gun violence, we now need to understand the nature of the conflict. And I'm arguing that this conflict is engineered. The idea of engineered conflict is that when a city has made a decision to cleanse itself of what has ever been deemed the problem, they will move so by way of policy and practice, or implementation of that policy. Now, a good friend of mine at UCLA, I gave a similar talk, and she said, so this is interesting, and she's an engineer. She said, the purpose of engineering is to eliminate human error. So if I think about an engineering of conflict, who has been deemed the error? And where do they live? And what are the conditions given their deeming to be the error? So now, what does this look like? So if we go to law enforcement tried something in the late 90s, and it actually went to the Supreme Court. some of you all may be familiar with something referred to as the Gang Terrorism Ordinance. Right, now, this is before the Iraqi conflict. This is before the broader war on terror. Now, the idea was, if 3 people were on the street and one was a known gang member, you could detain them all indefinitely. Right? Because this was around the time period that Richard M. Daley was arguing that the Chicago Police Department was outgunned. Right? And then around the same time, they were actually they were arguing and they were put forward to city council to actually arm police officers with M5 automatic weapons. Right? And if anybody's ever seen an M5 machine gun, an M5 machine gun can stop a car. Right? You can pop a mortar launcher on top of an M5 machine gun. Right? So this is a weapon of the war theater. So now, when we start to think about what law enforcement does with this gang terrorism ordinance, and an interesting thing, in 1999, the gang terrorism ordinance goes before the Supreme Court around a constitutionality argument. The city of Chicago loses. So the gang terrorism ordinance is deemed unconstitutional. But I'm a Chicagoan. Did it stop? Absolutely not. So now, when we start to think about these particular practices, they also did something else. And some people are familiar with RICO legislation. Now, Illinois has its own RICO Act. But the RICO Act that they first tried to engage was part of a federal act. And the federal act actually was engaged with the mafia. So when they wanted to actually put pressure on the mafia, they would engage in a RICO charge. And a RICO just means Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. And what RICO means is that it's a dragnet policy. So if one person is thought to be connected to a larger set of crimes, you can actually imprison large groups of people who now have some association with the crime. Right? Now, this worked with the mafia. And the idea was, with the mafia, if you actually got the head of the organization, the rest of the organization would crumble. They tried to do this with street organizations, i.e. gangs, in Chicago. It completely backfired. And one of the reasons why it backfired, and of course, law enforcement will not admit this. Now, every now and then, Tom Dark has these moments of clarity, but you don't know. Like sometimes, because Tom Dark's mental health stuff, he figured it out because the numbers are just too large, right? He's like, look, yeah, I got the largest mental health facility in the world, right here, right? Now, will he talk about this one? I don't know. Can I get next to Tom Dark to interview him? I don't know, right? Right, I might have to go through certain channels. I'm already on too many lists, right? So, what happens when this backfires? It backfires because something else is happening. So with organized crime, they were centrally located in certain hubs. There was a certain thing that splintered street organizations here in Chicago, i.e. gangs. And I refer to gangs as street organizations because it's not an accurate thing. Gangs is kind of racial dog whistle language, right? But when we really talk about the interactions of people, we're really talking about an organization. But what happens with street organizations here in Chicago, they get splintered because much of their housing is destroyed. So now they go to other neighborhoods. Now in Chicago, this becomes important because we live in a hyper-segregated city, right? There are parts of Chicago where you can be, where you will never see other parts of the city. There's certain conditions under which you can live to where it makes no sense for you to actually travel to other parts. And the easiest way to see hypersegregation in Chicago is to ride the train. Right? And all you have to do is name the spots and see how the train's population shifts racially. For me, it's always the Addison stop in the spring and summer. Right? Oh, you know where you are once you hit Addison. Here we go. Right? And for people who are unfamiliar with Addison, that's Wrigley Field. Right? That's the Cubs with their racist anti-Muslim asses. Right? So now, this thing around now saying this in real ways, we now start to think about that hypersegregation and what it means in real time. So now, that hypersegregation now has an affect when we look at things like the destruction of public housing and school closings. And the example that I like to use is not the 49 school closings, but an earlier school closing that happened in 2004. Many of us don't take into account school closing, and the west side of the city is actually a space that we haven't had a lot of conversations about post-1968. All right? And now there's some development conversation entering that area. But now, if we look at a school called Austin, Austin was closed in 2004. Now, if you live in the Austin community, you have two neighborhood schools. Austin is one, and the other one is never thought to be a neighborhood school to Austin. Does anybody know what that other neighborhood school is that serves Austin? Oh, River Forest, no, yeah, no, this is actually still in the city proper. All right? Right? The neighborhood school that also services the north end of the Austin neighborhood is Taft. Taft is currently the only neighborhood public high school that is majority white. It has been majority white since its founding. Taft is right at the street. But when Austin closed in 2004, and some of y'all noticed, they sent all the young people to Clemente. So let's think about that geographically or spatially. Austin is essentially, it's on a street called Pine. Austin is essentially on Lake and Central. Clemente is on the corner of Western and Division. Now, if you know about hypersegregation, if you're going from Central and Lake to Western and Division, you got to take some buses through some pretty heady situations. And what we now have to think about is a young person making the decision not to do that is making an informed decision as opposed to being a high school dropout. But what we haven't taken into account is how these conflicts get engineered. So we got the Austin example. Let's use another one. If I split this room in half, you all are one school, you all are another. I close you all and I send everybody here. What happens on the first day? Hell of fights.
Yeah.
Now, do that 50 times in one summer. What's the expectation? With people who have been moved into areas where they are unfamiliar. The state, like Fanon said, can instigate horizontal violence. In fact, it is the machination of the state to implement control by way of horizontal violence. So again, I don't want folks to leave tonight and be like, Stovall, is this a conspiracy? I don't want folks to get that. I want us to understand this as the machinations of public policy. But I also want us to understand this as the machinations of public policy that has also predicated itself with the understanding that the black body is rationalized as the gratuitous site of punishment. Right? This is Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spiller's work around looking at what does it mean if the black body is rationalized as a gratuitous site of punishment, then where will they go to schools? What will they look like? Where will they live? What will be the work of law enforcement to continually remind them that their bodies are the sites of gratuitous punishment? So what does it look like in a city? And we start to think about this in forms of epidemiology. The violence that young people engage amongst themselves is not the only public health concern. We now need to understand violence by way of the state as a public health concern. This is the hardest one to come to grips with. Because when we begin to look at these particular instances, these things don't come out of some broader conspiracy. They come out of a history of policies that have always been predicated around the suppression of poor black people. Now, it's critical for me to say this. Many folks look at this and they hear me talk about this and they say, well, Stovall, isn't this really about class? And my response is always, you cannot have a conversation about class without having a conversation about race in a city like Chicago. They are intimately connected. And what we have to understand is the ways in which they are intimately connected. And one of the things that actually facilitate that process. And when we start to ask these questions about that facilitation, this engineered conflict gets us to ask a different set of questions. Now, what I really appreciate about you all in Radical Public Health is that you all are asking the different questions around solutions. So again, this is not intended to depress the shit out of you. Right? Because y'all can hear you be like, damn, so we all gonna die. Right? It's not meant to do that. Right? Because the fourth component in this space is what I'm calling black fugitive futures. And the idea of black fugitive futures are people who live in recognition of this and are now working to end it. All right, so now when we start to talk about this, one of the ways to begin to think about black fugitive futures, and I'm using fugitivity because this is work by folks like Michael Dumas, Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spiller, who are saying that, and Fred Moten and Stephen O'Harney, who are saying that the work for justice has always been done fugitively. It is not done because of rules. It is often done in spite of those rules. So what is the work that operates fugitively? Making a way out of no way. Michael Dumas always says, and I always appreciate this for them, he says, fugitivity is not arguing that you are free. Fugitivity is making a decision to run. But now you got to figure out where are you running and who are you running with. Right? So this thing around now, when we operate fugitively, and this is actually a historical instantiation, because when people talk about the fugitivity of enslaved Africans, these were when people started to develop codes, ways in which to understand each other, fictive kin networks that protected folks, songs that told you when to go certain places. So now, these fugitive futures come by way of organizations that have asked very different questions. And somebody that you all should, if you haven't already put on your list for potential speakers, is a guy from the Sweetwater Foundation named Emmanuel Pratt. Huh? And Emmanuel Pratt actually works on the south side of the city in the neighborhood of Washington Park. And what they're doing is engaging in sustainable agriculture and what they refer to as sustainable building. So now, what does it mean to be able to self-determine while feeding oneself and building what they need? Right? Another organization is called Let Us Breathe. And Let Us Breathe was started by a group of folks who were responding to the uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri, after the death of Michael Brown. Now, what Let Us Breathe originally responded to was a group of DM messages from Palestinians to Ferguson protesters around what to do when they are attacked. So these Palestinian young folks sent messages to Ferguson and said, if you are tear gassed, here's what you need to do. And they just go through the practicalities of protecting your nose and eyes, covering the mouth. They sent all these messages and they said, if you are suppressed, if they build perimeters around you, here's how you need to move. So they're literally giving them a play-by-play through DM messages to say, here's what you need to do. And I always love how they ended it. Remember that we are with you and justice will come. So one of the calls from Ferguson was to get gas masks. And a group of 3 young folks here in Chicago said, who got gas masks? Right? So they take 40 gas masks to Ferguson. And after them going to Ferguson, they say, well, this can't be just a protest movement. We have to now think about our work in response to the issues and concerns of what's happening in Chicago, because law enforcement has a particular relationship here, and it's not too far from where we are now. So if folks know about the corner of Fillmore and Homan, it operated for almost 40 years as a black ops site. And it was a site of what the U.S. military would often refer to as extreme rendition. Now, as a South Sider, the corner of Fillmore and Homan was urban legend. Like we would always say, look, you do not want to be caught up out west. They're gonna take you to the, and all we knew it was is this spot. They're gonna take you to that spot, right? But what actually is happening, and this is how the Fillmore and Homan story gets out. 2 white dudes were caught up in a WTO protest here in Chicago. And just so happened, because this is in the age of the war on terror, they were deemed terrorists and they took them to Fillmore and Homan. And they kept them there for 3 days without any access to lawyers or the outside world. They let them out, and then they called the London Guardian. And the London Guardian did this report on the black ops site. Now, black folks in North Lawndale was saying, really? We done told y'all that for 40 years. 2 white dudes get caught up, and now y'all are incensed. Right? So now it comes out that for 40 years, the corner of Fillmore and Homan was actually a torture site for the Chicago Police Department. And the Let Us Breathe Collective did a 45-day encampment on the corner of Fillmore and Homan to bring understanding about this containment. So if people are living under these conditions, now what the Let Us Breathe Collective was asking is, what do we need to determine our freedom? And one of the things was, we need to have space to breathe. The philosophy of the Let Us Breathe Collective is, we will get what we need because we need it. All we have to do is make the request. Right? So the first thing that they did was make free space to give food and clothing to people. They call it the free store. Right? They call their first building the breathing room. And the idea was, and we've always had these black fugitive spaces, but now in naming these black fugitive spaces, it takes us to now rethink the engineering of this conflict. Because when we hear about violence or shootings, we rarely talk about displacement, dispossession, school closings, hypersegregation. It's only the lead of the violence. But if we're talking about addressing that violence, we need to know what facilitates it. And dare I say that I know that that's not the shooter. It's the conditions where the shooter operates. That's why I like our public health folks. Y'all actually say this. Right? Sometimes. Right, sometimes.